Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Linda Marone, Senior Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I will be your moderator today. Before we get started, just a housekeeping item. We will allow time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers, so please write yours in the chat area as they come to mind so that we can start getting them ready for our guest. And if we don't have time to answer all, we will make sure that they are available on our site, so not to worry. For those of you who are not familiar with DCL, we convert and organize content to create electronic documents, populate databases, publish on the web, and basically get data ready for tomorrow's technology. DCL services help you refine your document conversion strategy, identify document redundancy, extract metadata, transform legacy and future documents for real needs both today and in the future. As you will see, DCL serves a very broad client base spanning all industries. And now I would like to turn the mic over to Susan Lee to tell you about Just Systems. Susan?
Thank you, Linda. Hi, everyone. My name is Susan, and I'm the Marketing Specialist at Just Systems. For those of you who don't know, Just Systems is a leading global provider of office productivity, information management, consumer, and enterprise software. In Canada, we are the makers of XML, an XML-based software for structured authoring and content collaboration. We serve a broad range of industries as well, including aerospace and defense, government, and manufacturing, and we've been recognized for industry accolades, which you can see above there. And now I'd like to pass it back on to Linda.
Terrific. Thanks, Susan, and thank you for co-sponsoring today's webinar. We are thrilled today to have Keith Schengili-Roberts, an independent DITA consultant and trainer, and is the guy who talks to people for running bond software. Keith is going to tell you a little bit about himself before he gets started, and then we will get right into our session, DITA today and tomorrow. Without further ado, welcome, Keith.
Hello there. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Hello? Is there people there?
We can hear you.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, good. All right, so my name is Keith Schengili-Roberts. I am an independent consultant. I work with a firm called Mekon in the UK. I'm also an instructor on information architecture at the University of Toronto, and I've been working with DITA for the better part of the past 7 years. So I have been around the block several times when it comes to working with DITA. Been through DITA 1.0, 1.1, and currently 1.2, and currently working on consulting with various clients on ensuring that their setup for using DITA in the workplace is optimized. So without further ado, let's talk about today's presentation called DITA Today and Tomorrow. Now, by the way, I just want to point out I'm actually running this as a presentation based on PDF. The original version of this is actually a Prezi-based presentation. I'm just going to flip over to that very quickly. So hopefully you can actually see that. This is just as my web browser showing you the actual presentation format. Yes, hello?
You're not presenting your screen yet.
Oh, okay. Bear with me a moment. Let's try this. Screen is monitor 2. And with any luck, you should now see my screen.
There we go.
There we go. Perfect. Okay. Thanks for letting me know that. So just to let you know, if people want to have a look at this later, this is a dynamic presentation format. I have used this in a few previous occasions. The last one actually being a keynote speech that I did at the DITA North America conference a couple of months ago. And for technical reasons, we found that the zooming in and zooming out doesn't tend to work terribly well in the webinar format. So as a result, we're just going to stick with doing this as a PDF. So without further ado, basically talking about DITA, this will be a survey of looking at where DITA is today, who is using it, how they're using it, and also looking a little bit ahead, trying to understand a bit more about the ongoing evolution of DITA. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering about, who this guy is, and I already talked a little bit about myself. Let me just finish that off. I am a consultant at Mekon. I also was formerly the manager for documentation at AMD. I also, as I say, work as the lecturer on information architecture at the University of Toronto. Plenty of experience with DITA. I also host an industry blog site at ditawriter.com. And one of the things on this particular site is a listing of companies that have publicly said that they are in fact using DITA for their technical documentation process, which actually looks something like this. It's actually, if you go to the actual website, you'll get a listing that shows you this. You can actually then go in, look up individual company names. You can look up where they're located in terms of their headquarters, countries, and also check out their industry sector. And because I want to show the work, so to speak, there are links in most cases to the actual reference online where it's essentially said that yes, we are in fact using DITA. Now, a little caveat with this is that this information is it's informal. So this is contacts that I've made, that I've reached out to various people at various companies, asking them what their DITA usage is, and it is current as of the date in which I updated the list. So there are some companies here which I know are only starting down the DITA path, and there are several others that have been doing it for years. I just want to mention that because I don't want you to think, absolutely everybody here has been using DITA for years and years and years. In many cases, it's a bit of both. Firms at both ends of the DITA usage spectrum, so to speak. A lot of information there, and please take a look at it. And if in fact your firm is not listed, I would be very pleased to hear from you, and would love to add your company information to this listing. The more the merrier. Part of the reason for doing this list is to spread the information that in fact other firms are using DITA, and to know that you're in good company. So here's what I'll be looking at. Doing a very quick review of what DITA is, then looking at some of its strengths, or at least what I think some of its strengths are, and then doing a survey of who is using DITA and also where are they using it. And then I'm going to have some thoughts on what I think is holding DITA back from even greater acceptance in the technical writing community, and also using my crystal ball, so to speak, to gaze into the future of where I think DITA is going. Now, this is where I'd also like to thank the folks at Ixiosoft. They actually sponsored the original version of this talk at the DITA CMS conference that was held in Montreal. That was from a couple of weeks ago. I've since updated the information extensively, so this is, if in fact you were at the presentation back in Montreal, you will find many things from this which in fact are new. I'd like to start things off by talking about some non-DITA XML that's out there. This is something I would dearly like to try someday. This is DITA Light Chi Liquor. In fact, when I went and did an initial search when I was on a trip in Beijing about a year ago, and I did a search on the Chinese version of Google for DITA, this was the very first thing that came up on top of everything else. I've never tried this. Would love to try it someday. I've never been in a place where they've actually sold it, unfortunately. So if you tried it, let me know if it's any good. There's also a brand of field hockey sticks out there. These are girls' field hockey sticks made by a firm called DITA. They make not just the sticks, but all the things that would go with it. So they've got gloves, they've got balls. And when I was a manager at AMD, I thought seriously about acquiring one of these and using it as a motivator, so to speak. Never had to use that, of course, but it was kind of nice to know that such a thing existed. Another interesting thing is that while I know that in fact Caterpillar, the manufacturer of large heavy equipment, uses DITA for the technical documentation, it's also one of their line of engines. So this is, in fact, one of their large diesel engines, and it's from the DITA series, not to be confused with their documentation that uses the same thing. Another thing I also ran across is that in Spanish, apparently, a translation of DITA comes across, the first definition, as you see here, it says commerce, guarantee, and then surety, and then second meaning in terms of meaning of the term in the USA is debt, and then in Spain, credit. And I always scratch my head at meanings number 2 and number 3, and I always kind of wonder if maybe, the difference in those two meanings is part of the reason why Spain is having such a hard time these days in terms of its economic strategy. Could DITA be the cause? Well, no, probably not. DITA, of course, is also a name that's actually quite common for as a female first name in Europe. This is actually DITA Parbo, and she was a silent screen era film actress who was quite famous in a number of early French and German films. And because it's also a female name, it also gets used for things like, well, this particular boat, this barge, houseboat I think it actually is, which apparently cruises up and down the Rhine. And of course, if you've ever done any sort of search on DITA at all, I'm sure you are more than familiar with DITA Von Teese. She always comes up, at least in in Western search engines, as the top hit when you just type in DITA. Never let it be said that DITA is not sexy, because, well, clearly it can be. Moving on. What is DITA XML? Here's a quick review. So D is for Darwin, and that allows for the natural evolution of document types through inheritance and specialization. The IT part is for information typing, which gives you an information architecture for technical documents with the base topic types of concept, reference, and task. And of course, if you're thinking about 1.2, it also includes glossaries. I like to keep things simple. Let's talk about concept, task, and reference. And then the A is for architecture. And what is that? It's a model to be built on that encapsulates the best practices for both design and the authoring process. And as you can see, one of the strengths of DITA is reuse. In fact, and in some ways, I'd say that is one of the chief strengths of DITA as a technical documentation specification. And technical writers definitely see the value in reuse. Certainly in the various clients that I meet with, talking to the individual writers, they definitely get the fact that a lot of their colleagues are writing material that is very similar to what they themselves are doing, but they don't have a good mechanism to necessarily reuse it properly. And what I found in one of my own, again, relatively informal survey of about 100 users, why are people using DITA? Content reuse, far and away the most popular reason for why people want to use DITA. The other things are also quite interesting. The ROI argument is also quite significant. Localization cost savings for those firms that are translating their documentation as well. There's a definite and well-known reason for wanting to get on DITA in that regard. But what I believe that the main reason is exactly what you see here. Writers understand that DITA really helps enable content reuse. The interesting thing is actually one other interesting thing is I note that one of the questions is it are you using DITA because the tools are mature or because you really like the CMSs, and that's actually a really low score. So I don't think it's saying that they're not mature tools. Far from it. It's just saying writers are not interested in that end of things as much as they want to be able to reuse the content, both their own content and those of the other writers on the team. So, writers get that. Writers get that content reuse is a big deal and that DITA helps them do it. Now, there are some other advantages for technical writers. And by the way, as you probably noticed, this is a very graphically intense, not the right word, graphically, quite graphic. presentation, and I was actually looking for images of scribes and writers on Wikimedia Commons, where most of these images are actually come from, by the way. And it was funny because I ran across this one and several other of some medieval manuscripts of writers who were working on their own textbooks. And and in this particular case, there's an angel in the background. There's a, clearly this fellow's in a nice place. Doesn't look happy at all, does he? Never really too sure about that. Maybe it's because maybe it's because he's not using DITA. I don't know. But in any event, there are advantages for technical writers. One of the chief ones is, of course, less time spent formatting. And if you're using a traditional desktop publishing tool, chances are you're actually spending a good amount of your time not writing, but changing the header levels, tweaking the color of a particular font, changing the font. An interesting study that I did back about 6 years ago was I did a test of all of the writers on my team, and basically had them record over the course of the day exactly how much time they spent doing writing as opposed to straight formatting. What the fascinating thing that came out of this was that fully half their time was spent formatting as opposed to writing. And this was independent of the grade of the writers. So both the junior tech writer and the senior tech writers on staff were spending about the same amount of time, purely formatting their content. So one of the advantages of this for the writer is that you don't have to spend as much time changing all the headers from, say, header 2 to header 3 because, well, you've just put something else at a new header level above that. Having been there myself, I realize that that's an incredible pain, and it's really nice to essentially let the fact that format is separated from the content really take its course in this particular case, because that's exactly what DITA does. The other thing, and it's interesting, not all managers like me pointing this out, but I do like mentioning this, is that it does in fact stand out on a resume. As a former manager, I can tell you that in fact I lost in my time there. I lost 3 people directly due to the fact that they knew DITA and that other companies wanted their knowledge. Yeah, what was interesting is the in fact basically we trained them up, got them up and running, and then other companies realized that they were there as a resource, and sure enough they became a hot commodity. So this is something that if you are in fact thinking of going down this particular path, it is in fact something that does stand out on a resume, no doubt about it. It's also easier to get feedback on a topic than on a book. One of the clients that I've been working with of late, it's actually quite interesting. They've built their return on investment argument wholly on the fact that in fact their engineering staff is expected to not spend anywhere near as much time commenting and revising the actual, the books that they were handed by the writing staff before. Instead, the idea is they're just going to send them information directly at the topic level, have them review that. And not surprisingly, when you just give a subject matter expert, a SME, an individual topic or two to review, as opposed to here's a 200-page book, put it on the desk, please review by next Tuesday. Generally speaking, the latter option doesn't go down anywhere near as well, and maybe you'll hear back in that case, but quite often you don't. So in fact, the SMEs do tend to really do appreciate having things that are much more directed to their particular knowledge instead of having them weed through material. And of course, this is better for the writers as well, because the response rates tend to be significantly higher in this case. And nobody likes to be ignored, and especially after you've delivered, say, a 200-page document to somebody and ask them to review it. If you just give them the 1 or 2 or 3 topics that they need to actually look at, they tend to be much happier to do that, not surprisingly. Now, of course, there are several other known advantages of using DITA that corporations also know quite well. One of this is that the fact that there is significant reuse means that content does not have to be constantly rewritten. The way I like to put this is that basically the wheel does not have to be re-described. Of course, the other advantage with this, 1A, so to speak, the other correlating advantage is that your content correspondingly becomes much more consistent. So in this case, I have a picture of all these various wheels, and it's a question of, well, which wheel are we talking about? Which individual thing are we describing? And in this case, you just say, okay, it's this one. And then you make sure that that is essentially referenced however you want to do it within your documentation. So you all agree that this is the topic we want to represent our product or our what a particular concept or reference, however you want to put it, and that is the one that is promoted. Just the one. Consistency is one of the key things here. Now, the other interesting thing is that, of course, output can also be measured. So when you're using DITA within a content management system, that means that you can actually, then measure what you're doing much more properly than under a standard desktop publishing system environment. So, and hold on a second, I just want to make sure. Yes, okay. So, and one thing I like to point out is that, to my mind, as somebody who's done a lot of work on metrics, I find that you can essentially think of topics themselves as being sort of the atomic unit of measurement. You basically want to look at, say, how many topics are created by an author and how many topics are then, say modified by that same author. Add those two together, and then you can actually come up with some rather interesting results. Here's one published result from my time when I was at AMD, looking at the collated topics from all of the authors on my team, looking at it at a spread from Q3 2007 to Q4 2010. And what was interesting is that looking over more than a year's worth of topic data, is that I could then look at this and go, oh, okay, there are clear trends going on here. So generally speaking, Q3, certainly for 2008, 2010, tended to be a genuinely busy period. Less so for 2009, but that was due to not getting out as many products in that particular time frame. The interesting thing is that using data like this as a manager, I could argue with upper management saying, look, this is what we've done in the past. You just added however many new products to our list. That means we're going to be, we will need this many more writers to be able to tackle these additional projects. And the thing is that if you have numbers to back you up, your argument is much more convincing. Now, the other thing is that you can also show things like, in terms of actual production, you can also look at how DITA is actually potentially saving the company money. Again, oddly enough, this is something that upper management tends to like to hear. So here's another case in point. This is actually looking at the cost per topic between 2009 and 2010 with a trend line looking at it. So what this is looking at is the actual aggregate cost per topic for the individual months, and then that was then graphed against the actual wages for the people in the group. Now, as a manager, I knew what that was, but those numbers are not here for fairly obvious reasons. And you can actually see that there is, in fact, a nice linear trend going downwards. And I can say that, generally speaking, at the beginning of 2009, it was costing us about $28 or so to create each and every topic on average. And then by the end of 2010, that was down to about $25. So there's a clear, things were clearly getting more efficient in that particular case. And again, this is a sort of argument that tends to go down quite well with upper management. There are certainly many other types of metrics that can be applied. I'd actually recommend a forthcoming book by Mark Lewis that is coming out, I believe, in the August-September timeframe, which is looking at DITA metrics. He looks at all of the possible ways in which DITA usage can be measured and used by say management to further the aims of the department. Put it that way. Very good work. Very good work. I was asked to review it, and there's a lot of good information there. So little plug for Mark Lewis. Now another key thing there is also realizing that reuse translates to lower localization costs as well. The argument for this is again fairly straightforward. I mean, if you end up using the same topic in, say, English from one document to another, not surprisingly, you don't have to retranslate that as much. Now, if you're using things in a more traditional desktop publishing environment, because the content is not separated from format in that way, you're paying each and every time significant costs for doing layout work, even if in fact there's no change to the actual words that have been made for a good chunk of the document. Just need a few changes here and there, and lo and behold, you actually have to do significant reformatting elsewhere. The other thing is that with putting the content within a CMS or other tools that you can actually then leverage in this particular circumstance, and you can actually do things such as, do much better work on things like what's known as fuzzy matching. So you may in fact already have words which have been translated. They may occur together in, say, pairs or in phrases, and depending on the CMS you're using, it may recognize that and go, oh, okay, wait a second. You don't have to retranslate this. That same phrase is used somewhere else, and here's how it was translated that time. In this case, the translation house looks at that. Generally speaking, they will then review that work, but the cost of the review is significantly lower than having to retranslate it and then, say, reformat it using a DTD environment from scratch. So, and again, the more languages you do, the better and better the return on investment argument is for that. Okay, so as these are all very good reasons to use DITA. Now, what's interesting is to see the spread of DITA usage all around the world. Now, this may not be terribly surprising, but from what I've been able to find in my survey, almost 3/4 of DITA users are, in terms of the firm's headquarters, are based in North America. Outside of that, the next highest group is in Europe with 21%, and then following that with Asia with 6%, and then Australia at 1%, and then as you can see, South America and Africa with 0.25% each. Now, again, this is what I've been able to find. I actually strongly suspect that usage in South America is higher than I'm representing here, at least in part because of the term DITA in Spanish is in fact a financial term, so it's much harder for me to find information on firms using DITA in a non-financial sense. Looking at just a bit closer at things, here's actually a quick map of the United States, and as you can see, there's a key grouping on the West Coast in California in particular. A lot of firms in the Bay Area around San Jose and San Francisco, and then also some further south in LA and San Diego. And then there's another major cluster along the East Coast, running roughly from New York City down to New Jersey and Delaware, with key pockets in and around Chicago, Seattle and Washington, and also some areas in Texas, so Austin, San Antonio, and Houston, and not Dallas as well. So some key DITA-based firms are in all of these areas. So with few exceptions, DITA is in use all over the place in the States. If anybody wants to make a guess as to what types of firms tend to be using DITA within California, California is probably best known in many respects for the many number of software firms there, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but you'd be right in thinking that in fact the main concentration in California is primarily software firms. On the East Coast, it's actually slightly different, which we'll see. In Europe, again, quite a number of firms using DITA are based in and around the UK. Primarily in the London area and its suburbs, so to speak. But what was interesting is that when I did the work on this, it dispelled the notion, for me at any rate, that DITA is a purely English language phenomena. Because I looked at all of these other firms, and sure enough, there are many other firms that are clearly not working necessarily natively in English that are using DITA. And actually, I want to flip over, and I'm hoping that you can see this. I'm going to flip over to my browser. This actual map is was created using a nice online application called BatchGeo, and the URL is present there. I'll make sure that it's available for users at the end of this talk if they want to see it. But if you want to actually go in and see where all the various users are, sure enough, you can actually zoom in and see exactly where they are. And I'm zooming in this case on California. Hope you can all see that. And it actually, if you go to the individual marker, it'll say which company is actually represented. And if I go up to, just for fun, go up to British Columbia. Where are we here? All the way up. Here we are. Bluestream, TELUS, trying to find where Just Systems is located, because I know they're on here somewhere. But in any event, we know they're there. Okay. Now, the other interesting thing is I wanted to point out is that 6% may seem a relatively low number of DITA usage in Asia. But when I dig a bit deeper, this is the usage in Asia is definitely higher than this number would suggest. So, when I have a look at actual job postings for, say, in this case, India, what I'm finding is that there are many places which are looking for DITA technical writers. It's just that the companies that they're working for, their headquarters are not located in India. They're various branch offices, and I can further testify to that. I have done DITA training to technical writers in places like, say, Bangalore, at companies that are not necessarily based there. They just have a branch office. Definitely significant interest in this in places like India, also in Japan, Korea, and and China. So there's significant interest in that. And I think we're going to see that grow over time. There's definite real interest in using DITA in those environments. Sadly, though, I cannot find any DITA usage in Antarctica. It seems to be the only continent which has absolutely no DITA representation that I'm able to find. So down there are some DITA. There's some penguins that have no idea about the advantages of doing things in. Okay, that makes no sense. Okay, hopefully I got a laugh. Now, in terms of the actual breakdown, the types of firms which are actually using DITA, this is the industry breakdown, and not surprisingly, at least to my mind, given the fact that DITA more or less started off in use at firms that were heavily into software, such as, say, IBM. Not surprisingly, almost 30% of firms using DITA are, in fact, software-based firms. But it's interesting to look at the spread. What else is here? There's also technical documentation solutions. Healthcare information technology is a significant chunk. Education and training, including several universities, which I found quite interesting. Semiconductors, telecom, computer hardware, finance, consumer electronics, the petroleum industry is also big into DITA. And by the way, given the numbers we're talking about here, 1% does not equal one firm. It generally has to equal at least 3 or 4. So there's some significant numbers going on here. So some example firms of software firms that have said that they're using DITA include the ones you see here, for example. I'm sure there's some very familiar names that you'll see here. Similarly, those who are doing technical documentation solutions, these are firms who are in the business of providing technical documentation services on behalf of clients. So not surprisingly, they want to do things efficiently. Therefore, they're on top of doing this sort of thing as well. By the way, consultants also sort of figure into this particular area, and that's in part where my firm Mekon figures in. But the same goes true for several of the other firms represented here. Then also education and training services. So a couple of the universities that you see here are using it for some of their particular training efforts. They find the informal interviews I've done with a couple of people at these places are finding that the learning and training specialization is exactly what they want. So that's, they're very heavily invested in that particular area. So it's some real interest in that. And then also, to my mind, almost a little bit surprising that healthcare information technology, and one of the things that I think bodes well for DITA in general is the fact that it is gaining high usage in this particular sector because, generally speaking, they are under other strictures to make sure that what they're presenting in terms of information is accurate. Because let's face it, if a life and death situation, you want to make sure that your documentation is as accurate as possible. And it's nice to see that DITA can clearly fulfill that need. There's also a number of semiconductor firms. Of course, that looks into a bit of my background, so AMD is certainly represented there. But many other firms are here: ARM, NVIDIA, Texas Instruments, ST Micro, and Freescale. And what was interesting is that when I compared that list of all the firms that in the semiconductor business to iSupply's ranking of the top 20 semiconductor firms, at least half of those firms are using DITA. And I say at least half, that what you see there is half. I strongly suspect that most of the rest are using it as well, but I can't find public information to that effect. So in at least one segment, it seems like DITA is dominant in terms of technical communication, and I suspect that may be true in other areas too. But give me more time and research. I'll see if that can be proved to be true. A number of telecom firms are doing DITA. RIM, Avaya, Motorola, Hughes, True Position, Nokia, and also Apple. Though I lump that into with one of the other firm groups from an earlier slide. And then looking at other ones, financial services, PayPal, MasterCard, FICO, Jack Henry, they all use DITA. Well, there's Apple again, and consumer electronics, Samsung as well, TomTom, the manufacturer of geolocation units, and also petroleum companies, PTRC, Schlumberger, Chevron, Tesoro are all using it as well. So it's interesting to see the spread, but then you're probably kind of wondering at this point, well, what about that other 23% I saw on the pie graph? Well, what's interesting is that it represents a myriad of other firms that in a number of other different categories. And if you look at this listing of companies, and this is not a complete listing by any, this is sort of me cherry picking some of the better known ones. But in this listing alone, you're looking at, say, office products, injection molding, machine tools, heavy equipment manufacturers. In fact, if anything, heavy equipment manufacturers seem to be the next up and coming segment in DITA usage from what I'm able to find. Aerospace and defense, energy production, wind turbine manufacturers, mining, plumbing fixtures. You probably see, where is it? Yeah, Kohler. That's that's them. Online bookseller. That would be Amazon. Supercomputing. Cray. Cray is using DITA for their documentation efforts. Pre-press hardware, exercise equipment. That would be Nautilus. Sensor manufacturers, cloud computing, geoimaging, and marine navigation. That's what the Konigsberg one at the bottom is. So many, many different firms using DITA. And I found it very interesting to see this very wide spread of firms using DITA for their own purposes, which tells me, at least in part, I have to wonder, why is there such diversity in this particular case? And the more I delve into it, I think this quote from Darwin really, brings it up. He was trying to explain essentially that it's not the fact that it's the strongest of the species that survives necessarily. Trying to clarify that that well-known statement. It's not the strongest nor the most intelligent that survive. It's the one that's most adaptable to change. And I think that's one of the key things that also applies to DITA. It is highly adaptable. I think based on that is part of the reason why we're going to see, it's going to continue on. It allows for the natural evolution of document types through inheritance and specialization. Therefore, flexibility built right into the system. And it's also adaptable to specific environments. I think one nice case of that is looking at the various technical subcommittees, which are looking at specializing DITA for particular sectors. So we see the DITA semiconductor group, the DITA machine industry, the DITA learning content, and the translation subcommittee. They're all playing a very significant part. And I suspect that over time we're going to be seeing more of these types of groups. So here's my first. I'm out there. Big prediction. I suspect DITA will in fact be quite a long-lived specification. Hopefully this will not haunt me in 10 years plus time, but we'll see what happens. But I think that it's a fair enough thing to say that it will certainly be around for some time to come. Now, what about some of the challenges to DITA? Because there are some. And what I'm finding is that it has less to do with competing XML standards, which a lot of people might think, and has more to do with technical limitations with DITA adoption within the firms which are trying to implement them. So while anybody, just about anyone, can adopt DITA, there are some real challenges that remain. So one of the chief ones I find is that we need to make formatting output much easier. Here you have a standard. The idea is straightforward. You have XML. You merge it with some XSLT. You then process it through the XSLT processor, and hey presto, you get a document. But of course, anybody who has done this above and beyond the DITA OT realizes that much like a fine Swiss watch, the workings of the XSL process can be both intricate and in some cases can be costly. There are often firms that actually have a significant DITA background or makeup. Quite often will have dedicated programmers working on the XSL content. So for smaller firms, that is a real impediment to progress in that area that I'm finding. There are also some places where DITA is perceived as too complex, and this was a nice sample email I found in a forum, which I think puts across the argument quite well. In some ways, in fact, there's a lot of talk that in fact maybe it's expanding too fast. There's in some ways the vast number of new tags and fairly complex ideas such as rel tables and con key refs and so forth can actually does not make for a compelling argument for simplicity, put it that way. Now the thing is that of course when you cut things down to what writers actually need, they almost always need a particular subset of the DITA XML spec to work with, but it's hard to know that when you're just starting from scratch. So this is a perception which I hope over time will, again, through a presentation like this, people will understand that that's in fact not the case, and to get over this hurdle and to then realize that in fact DITA is not as complex as you might first think. It's not so much complex, it is diverse, put it that way. There's a lot that you can actually do with the material that's there. But you can start off small. And again, just keep it to a minimal set of tags that you actually need to use instead of, say, adopting the full learning and training specialization if, in fact, you're not going down that particular path right away. Now, the other thing is that I'm also finding that DITA, it may not be still fully mature in the industry. Now, this slide and the next slide is courtesy of Common Sense Advisory. They are a group that actually market their services to translation buyers. And in this particular case, they did a survey of various translation firms, localization service providers. That's what LSP means in this case, that process DITA content. And they asked you know, a rather large number of LSPs, 867. So this can be considered, you know, definitive. And this, by the way, is information from about this time last year, so it's still relatively current. And you know, and they asked them what percentage of LSPs process DITA content for their clients, and more than half said we don't process DITA. Period. The next most segment is also interesting. What's DITA? Almost 30% of those firms. Yikes. Isn't that interesting? And yet the remaining 15%, they knew what it was and, you know, presumably are coping with it very well. And I'm expecting, of course, that particular slice will grow over time. But even after all this many years, there are still, you know, translation firms out there that still, you know, not only, you know, don't process it, but still are, you know, basically say, you know, what is that? So we haven't quite hit that, level of maturity as yet. And for the slide that sort of backs up that point, how big are these firms? Again, it didn't actually seem to matter a whole lot. The firms that actually processed it were almost any size. Not surprisingly, the largest firms tended to be the ones that processed DITA. That's at 36%. But the spread after that was actually fairly even after that. So again, I'm also hoping that increased demand over time will solve this type of problem. Now the other thing is also getting social media right in terms of using DITA with it. My colleague Naz Urbina at Mekon had this to say, you know, we have to make it clear to our clients that it's all about collaboration and efficiency, not, you know, cute videos of kittens. That's not what it's about. But things have to be done right. You can't just put, and I have seen this, you know, put a like tag on my document. You know, that's not really the way it's likely to work. So one nice thing I've seen is actually a product called DITA Web, where you can actually throw in, you can actually open up the database to comments from the users, and this actually works in a native DITA environment. I think we're going to be seeing more of this sort of thing in the future. Now, realizing I'm running out of time, I'm going to speed things up a little bit. All I want to say, just to conclude this point, is that, you know, social media is clearly here to stay, but, you know, we need to make sure that content can be found and is relevant, because otherwise we, meaning the technical writers, may go the way of the dodo. Very sad-looking dodo there. Another quick challenge, I also find that technical writers need to be relevant. This is actually a picture of my clothes washer, a Kenmore Series 90, if you remember right. And it stopped working properly one day. And when I went Googling the information, I found that, in fact, there was a YouTube video that explained things quite thoroughly. And I went to that video, and it told me everything I needed to know. I didn't have to go to the documentation because the video told me all I needed. So technical writers need to realize that, you know, users have powerful publishing tools available to them, and that we're now competing in some ways with our users to make sure that we get, you know, our point across. And what that means is that we need to be relevant. You know, information is useless if it can't be found and retrieved. When I did further digging, because as a good information architect, I went, it's like, okay, where is the documentation on this? And, you know, sure enough, I did find it. And this was about 6 or 7 Google page views into it, and I found it eventually. And did it list my particular problem? No, it didn't. And it didn't have any information on how I could solve it. The YouTube video was far and away better. So again, technical writers need to stay relevant. We need to be in contact with our audience. Now, you know, now I want to look at a little bit into the future of where I see DITA is going. And of course, one of the things that everybody's asking about is, you know, what about tablets? And it's, you know, again, tablets are clearly here to stay. And the, you know, we have here an iPad, we have the BlackBerry device, and in the upper right is the forthcoming Windows 8 based tablet that Microsoft is definitely going to be pushing. It's clear that technical documentation is going to be much more mobile. And again, one of the things I think is one of DITA's strengths is the fact that DITA in this topic-based approach, puts across chunks of information which can be easily digested, one page screen at a time, in which case I think it's ideally suited for tablet use. QR codes in DITA, yes, I think arguably where it makes sense to do so. I've heard of, in some cases, some manufacturers inserting QR codes that then point essentially to individual topics on a web server, which can then be used. Another interesting thing is that an increasing amount of internet traffic is non-human. Now, the interesting thing is when you look at this, some of it is okay, due to things like spam and all the rest of it. But what's interesting is that it's an increasingly large number of, say, search engine derived and automated searches and spidering and so forth is going on, which means that semantically described content will become even more important and ought to be more relevant in various searches in the future because of this. So, in some ways you're writing not only for the human users but also for semantic processing by machines that understand it. This is part of the reason why getting short descriptions right in DITA is really key. Another thing to watch for is that there are many more devices coming down the pipe soon that are situationally aware and will respond accordingly. So in other words, they'll know when you're looking at them and when you're seeking information from them. And again, having a topic-based approach, having information in small chunks seems to be what's needed for this environment. Now, we're only at the very beginning of this. This is another sort of mini revolution I think we're going to be seeing much more in the next 2 or 3 years. Ultimately, when you look at these various things impinging on the future, what I'm finding is that it's still ultimately all about meeting the user's needs when and where they need it, on demand. So I think DITA's topic-based approach to static data is clearly working well and is here to stay. And again, part of the reason for this, is also looking at the information typing, looking at the individual task structure. This part has been, I think, it's been got right. And while nothing is future-proof, DITA is less likely to be replaced by something that is wholly new. It's much more likely that whatever comes next is going to evolve from DITA's very sound fundamentals. The other thing I want to mention just before concluding is that I really do think that DITA birds of a feather really ought to swim together. So please everybody keep up the dialogue outside of these webinars and conference sessions that you might attend. And that is it for me.
Terrific. Thank you, Keith. We do have some questions that came in, and I believe we have some time that we could handle at least a couple. Sure. Again, Keith will be answering any that we do not get to today so that we can have them published and ready on our website for you. We have one, and this came in about halfway through. Keith, I think you did address some of it, but I think it's important. Benefits described so far are common to XML generally. So what is so special about the DITA flavor of XML?
Again, I think that the topic-based approach is, the idea that topics need to essentially stand alone. They must bring their context along with them. I mean, one of the things that I've been looking at in firms that have been going from, say, a book, a docbook format, migrating to DITA, is that the key shift is away from a narrative style to a much more topic-based style, and that's a real shift for the writers. It's a real change. But once they get that, and especially when it's combined with something like with minimalist writing principles, you get much bigger bang for the buck. You get better reuse all around, and again, better. Again, putting my information architect hat on again, much better at conveying information to the users in a compact and useful form. There was one case that I did again at AMD. We had a sort of like a Bible-like document, and it was very much initially in sort of the narrative format. it was about typically 600 to 800 pages long. After doing a full content inventory, doing full IA work on it, and DITAfying it, we shrank that down to a document that was often about 200-300 pages. More at least half to more than half that size of the original document. And what was interesting is that over time we realized that the document was in fact was actually being used much more than previously. Tech writers tend not to hear praise for their documents. I mean, that's part of our life, I think, really. But tech writers always hear complaints. We didn't hear any complaints from that at all, and we were expecting them. So what was interesting is that we figured there was a real net gain in that environment.
Yeah,
I think that answers that question.
Yeah, one thing, if I might add to that also from our experience in talking with our clients, is that because every company today is basically a publisher, and almost all companies are looking at multi-channels for publishing their content, where XML is certainly flexible, DITA allows them to take specific chunks of content and use it in specific ways where they may not want to take everything. And it just makes it much easier to move that content around and be able to, as you said, multi-purpose it accordingly.
Right. Again, another example which illustrates that point is that I remember being pleasantly surprised finding that a concept topic that was being used in this Bible document, which was aimed, I thought, at electrical engineers, was actually then repurposed quite well in an end-user document. Exact same concept. Why re-describe it twice for different audiences when if you do it once, it works in both quite well, and that's exactly what happened.
Correct. Excellent. Another question, Keith. What is the typical adoption period in months from the point where a company has the tools to do DITA to when its writing staff is fully engaged and effectively writing in a DITA model? This should be interesting. I'm anxious to hear your answer.
Wow. Okay, that's a good question, and I think that the safe answer for me on that would be, it depends. But seriously, it really, you need to think about, what is the size of the team? Is it, if it's one writer, for example, writing, against one product, then the transition can be, loading up the DITA OT and starting to use that. I mean, I've actually seen that. So the transition period in that case would be, a week or two, so to speak. But realistically, that's not what most people are facing. We're looking at a team of writers, and usually several deliverables and products at once. What I find is the smart way of doing things in this environment is to make sure the writing staff has sufficient time to adjust. You might want to nominate a few people in the team as being the leads to make to forge ahead, come up with templates for how a DITA document ought to look like, and then over time let the other people on your writing staff then convert over to the new format. In a couple of cases that I can think of, the transition from desktop publishing tools to producing first production quality document in DITA was, and this may seem like a long time, but believe me, it's not. It was 6 months. I can think of at least 2 solid cases where that was the case. Now, of course, it's not that they stopped producing documents during that time. They, in fact, had to do both. They had to do the DTB and the DITA-based docs at the same time. But the longer the transition period, the more comfortable the writers become writing in the new format and using whatever tools they're using to make that happen. And the greater the success from what I've seen. So again, that is for 2 firms that I can think of where we're looking at writing staffs in the several dozen in size and geographically dispersed over North America and Europe and China in this particular case. So lots of additional challenges there. So your results may vary depending on size and intent, I guess.
Correct. Yeah. On that note, is DITA implementation more suitable for a small team rather than a decentralized team structure?
I would say that I'd say in some ways it's actually equally good for both environments, but for different reasons. With the very small teams, it's easier for them to more or less turn on a dime and change over to doing things in that particular way. But for large firms with geographically dispersed writers, the key thing for them in some ways is then being able to share information. They're de-siloing the writing staff. So again, one of the nice things is there's sort of the built-in serendipity of using DITA within, say, a content management system, because then the writers can go searching for content that somebody else has written, and then if they see that, it's like, oh, okay, that's all I need. Then I'll just conref into that, or I'll make a copy of that, and I'll use that particular topic in my map, and it then saves them the time of having to rewrite that. And again, it's for larger firms, there's serendipitous reuse. For very small teams, it's much more down to getting making sure that everybody's working on a common platform. In some ways that's almost a more important thing for teams of that are say smaller than 5 in this particular case, and who may or may not be using a CMS.
Yeah, terrific. I think that's very, very helpful. Well, thank you, Keith. And thank you, everyone, for attending. I will let you know that Keith will be authoring an article related to the same topic for our September newsletter. So if you're not already a subscriber, please make sure that you do sign up. I think it's going to kind of continue on in the same vein and give you a little bit more feedback, certainly incorporate your questions. This concludes today's broadcast. I want to thank Just Systems as our co-sponsor and valued partner, and to let you know you will be able to access the recorded version from the webinar archive section of dclab.com. Also, please join us for our third webinar in the Ask the Experts series on Wednesday, July 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Keith.